Damaged Defenders by Scherzab. Chapter 121. Gamora and Peter Quill. Thanos was utterly, completely, and totally insane in the worst of ways. He had no morals, no empathy, no nothing, only a bottomless, unfathomable, and unquenchable desire to kill, maim, and torture, mostly kill, everything in his path. What made this worse was that Thanos was not the sort of insane that was stupid and ineffectual. For all his insanity, his intelligence remained intact, and he was capable of making cunning, well-thought-out, and long-reaching plans. He was capable of pretending, at least in the short term, to be something other than insane, especially when such pretense somehow furthered his goal to kill everything in his path. Long and long ago, Thanos realized that for all his power, he could not be in two places at one time. He needed lieutenants to act in his stead when his plans required his presence in more than one place. Over the millennia, he fashioned himself such lieutenants by means of coercion, blackmail, torture, brainwashing, and flat-out mind control. When they were killed or outlived their usefulness one way or another, he replaced them. Gamora and her sister, Nebula, were but the latest in a long line of such lieutenants. In their cases, Thanos had done what his warped, twisted, and insane mind was capable of to make both females think of him as a father figure. This, of course, included wiping out their real families, along with, it had to be said, the rest of their species as a whole, and then convincing them he saved them from the depredations of the being who had wiped out their planet, their people, and their families. It helped his deception that there were, in fact, beings or groups of beings capable of such other than himself. For her part, Gamora had been a toddler when Thanos had claimed her. She had but the vaguest of memories of her parents. For decades, Thanos fed her naught but lies, manipulated her, experimented on her, and altered her body and even her mind under the guise of making her better able to serve him. For a long time, those faint memories of her parents got lost under the weight of all Thanos did and said. For a long time, Gamora was Thanos' willing, eager lieutenant, obeying his commands and exercising his will without mercy or compunction. It did not help matters that Nebula remained wholly fanatically loyal to Thanos, thus encouraging Gamora's own loyalty to him. But somewhere along the way, there came a day when Gamora began to perceive that something was not right in how she had been raised and continued to live. Perhaps it was those half-buried memories. Perhaps it was her observations of families when she was out and about doing Thanos' bidding. Whatever it was, Gamora gradually became aware that something was definitely wrong. It took a good deal of time after that for her to do more than perceive the wrongness. It had been ingrained in her, literally and extremely painfully, to never, ever, under any circumstances, defy or even disagree with Thanos. It took years before Gamora was capable of considering trying to get away from Thanos without freaking herself out. At which point she was faced with a serious problem. If she refused to obey Thanos or fled, well, she would be hunted down, very probably by Nebula, who remained unquestioningly loyal to her father. Once brought before Thanos, Gamora had no doubts as to what her fate would be. The far side of the universe would hear her agonized screams. So, for years, she pretended her loyalty out of fear. She had nowhere to run that Thanos could not follow, and no resources of her own to even attempt such a thing. But then, he came. Fell into their grasp, more properly. At first, he had offered no resistance. Gamora thought he might have been too battered, bruised, and worn from his fall to do anything right away. Within a day, he had perceived what sort of mad creature he had fallen into the grasp of. Yet, despite knowing Thanos would win, he hissed and spat and raged and fought. Even when his body had been beaten into submission, his mind refused to bend or break. It had taken Thanos taking control of his mind to silence his rebellion. Even then, in the day or so he'd been thus before he'd been sent to fetch the Tesseract, Gamora had perceived flickers of grim determination and defiance in the depths of his eyes, as if he had yielded to the mind control before it could consume him utterly or some such. But neither Thanos nor Nebula seemed to have perceived what Gamora had. Thus she alone was unsurprised when he won free and promptly put what stop he could to Thanos' current scheme. If he could do so, how could she do this? First, though, she had to survive Thanos' tantrum over being thwarted. She, Nebula, and the other all barely survived Thanos' wrath over that failure. Gamora had the sinking sensation that the only reason they'd survived was because Thanos still had need of them and did not have the time to mold new lieutenants if he killed the three of them. Once he calmed down, Thanos sent both herself and Nebula on missions in his name. He sent them to fetch him weapons, specifically the Infinity Stones. The stones, which could not be destroyed by any means anyone had yet discovered, had long ago been scattered all over the known universe and hidden. It had taken Thanos millennia to track them down. Even now, he did not know the locations of all of them. The bad news being he'd collected the Mind Stone a millennium ago. He'd known where the Power Stone and the Space Stone were since before Gamora's birth, but had not yet collected them as he had been invested in building his army and finding the remaining stones. It had only been his appearance that had changed Thanos' plans. Best of all, for Gamora's plans, Thanos was forced to send herself and Nebula in opposite directions. It would take Nebula weeks to get to where Gamora had been sent once word reached her of Gamora's defection. Better, Thanos would not be able to comfort her himself. He had to guide the army he had built. He was the only one who knew the way to so-called Midgard from their remote corner of the universe. Best of all, Thanos would not be able to use the Mind Stone to regain control of her, not without having some idea of where she was to aim his strike at her. It was even conceivable the Mind Stone would not be able to reach that far, even if he did know her exact location. Gamora didn't know the limitations of the stones, after all, and she wasn't sure Thanos did, either. First, she would find the stone. Whatever else happened, the Power Stone had to be kept out of Thanos' grasp. She would either find a way to destroy it, or, lacking that, because see the previous note on their indestructibility, flee to the far side of the universe with it and keep running to keep it out of Thanos' grasp. Or perhaps if she could find a way to get there before him, she would deliver it to those Thanos sought to destroy. She was also considering hunting Nebula and putting a stop to her finding the Space Stone. With it, Thanos would be able to cut the trip short, along with who knew what sort of other things. But Gamora was reluctant to contest with Nebula, not out of any sort of warped sister feeling, but simply because any contest between them would be very equal and very long drawn out and just plain ugly. Maybe if Gamora knew where the Space Stone was at and could get there faster than Nebula, she could have simply made off with it and left Nebula empty-handed. Unfortunately, Thanos had been bright enough to not tell either of them where exactly the other was going and where the other's stone was at. Aside from the problems inherent in stopping Nebula, there was the fact that, at least in Gamora's opinion, the Space Stone was far less of a problem in Thanos' hands than the Power Stone. Yes, Thanos getting himself and his army there faster would be a problem, but not as big of a problem as Thanos, who already had a great deal of personal power, showing up with literally unlimited power. Besides, the odds were very, very good that Nebula would manage to have the Space Stone in hand before she was sent to fetch Gamora. And even if she did, Thanos would not want her to waste time bringing the stone to him before going after Gamora, especially if Gamora had the Power Stone in hand. Doing so would add a week or more to the time it would take Nebula to catch up to her. So there was a good chance that both stones would be kept from Thanos' grasp. That possibility pleased Gamora. The so-called ass end of space, where Thanos had been banished by the realms of Yggdrasil, had long ago learned to fear him, and to resign themselves to their fate when he came calling. It had been proven time and again that Thanos could and would wipe out any planet, or entire galaxy for that matter, that garnered his attention. No planet had ever successfully fought him off. A rare few had managed to temporarily beat him back, but he returned at a later date with a bigger army and/or better weapons and wiped them out. There were usually a few survivors of such massacres, but with nowhere to go home, no money, and no other resources, they were forced to scrabble for a living. Little wonder, then, that most of this end of space had descended into lawlessness of one variety or another. There were still a few societies, like the Xandarians, who hadn't been wiped out, and thus still had a functioning government, laws and such. They attempted to keep some sort of law and order going as far as they could reach, but they were the exceptions to the rule, and, to be honest, not all that effective outside of their own territories. It was into this lawless scramble for whatever scraps of resources could be stolen that Peter Quill was abducted as a child. He was raised, if it could be called that, by the leader of one of the more organized groups of bandits. Yondu was cruel and vicious and ruled the Ravagers through fear, and raised Peter in the same mold. Both fortunately and not, Peter had been old enough at the time of his abduction to know and remember his upbringing and cling to it as best he could. He hadn't been entirely successful. His morals had got a bit bent and twisted out of sheer necessity. Despite Yondu's best attempts, Peter had never descended to Yondu's level. He stole and salvaged because it was either that or be killed, but he refused to be vicious, heartless, and cruel. Even after he had managed to win some level of independence from Yondu, Peter had to be careful to play the man's game. The ship he was renting from Yondu was only capable of short hops from planet to planet within this galaxy. Not to mention, Peter was pretty sure there were fail-safes in the ship that would allow Yondu to recall it if he so desired. Peter's ultimate goal was to figure out which way Earth was and steal a ship that could handle a journey of that length. Because while Peter was fairly sure that his grandfather and remaining family were either dead or had given him up for same by now, he did still want to get back to Earth. Finding Earth was in no way as easy as it sounded. For one thing, Peter was, as far as you could tell, the only human anyone in this galaxy had ever seen. For another, no one here used the same names for galaxies as the folks back on Earth. Not that Peter had been able to remember more than Milky Way, by way of galaxies. And Peter had absolutely no idea how long they'd traveled or in what direction after his abduction. He had been rather understandably freaked out at the time, and hadn't paid any attention to such things even if he'd had access to them. So he couldn't even make an educated guess as to where to start looking. But for once, Peter wasn't thinking about that or how to placate Yondu without getting into more trouble than he was willing to tolerate. No, today Peter was worrying about something else entirely. Thanos was on the move out of the general vicinity, which was surprising. Rumors as to his intended target were flying everywhere. Peter had also heard vague rumors that Thanos wanted a weapon, one that was hidden somewhere in this galaxy. He had, according to the rumors, sent someone after said weapon. It hadn't taken much to convince Yondu that there was a profit to be made if they got to the weapon first. Yondu charged Peter with the task. Of course, Peter had absolutely no intentions of surrendering such a weapon. If it in fact existed, rumors could be very unreliable. To anyone. Not Yondu, not an emissary of Thanos, and for sure not to Thanos himself. First, though, he had to get a better bead on the rumors and figure out what was fact and what was fiction. If there wasn't actually a weapon, well, he'd find something to appease Yondu and go from there. If there was a weapon, well, the race was on.